this is Caitlin here, and welcome back to Card Game Wednesday, the day of the week where we enjoy all things card game related. And today we are talking about Valhalla, or New Valhalla, as we're going to be calling it, or rather, what I'm going to be calling it from here on out, because I feel like it's kind of weird to call this cluster Valhalla when we technically already had a Valhalla cluster, but we don't really count it as part of the sets. But now we are counting it because the lore from it is going to actually impact in some way, even if it's just a small way, and it's just really confusing. So I'm just going to call it New Valhalla from here on out, just to save a little bit of confusion here. But I'm going to be talking about something story related, or rather kind of lore related, in terms of where we're going now in the future of the story. We got like a slight glimpse of what the setup to this new cluster is going to be, thanks to the reveal of the new kind of website for the new cluster that's starting in September. We've got like a brief little summary here, and it does seem to have taken some parts of the lore from the original Valhalla, rather. So what I'm thinking here is that it says, oh, the original Valhalla, they had their war and whatnot, and eventually they were like, okay, this war is never going to end because we're all gods, we're going to, we're never going to die, or blah, blah, blah. So the easiest way to sort that is that they made this kind of proxy world, where they made this new world where they'd make champions and new armies that would represent them in the fight for like the war of Valhalla. This war went on and on and on between all these different factions and everything, but there still didn't seem to be an end to it. So eventually the old gods forgot about this world that they made, and they just decided, you know what, let's just continue fighting what we were doing. So they completely forgot about the war, restarted their own war, and then eventually they seemed to wipe themselves out. The old Valhalla as we knew it was forgotten, and this proxy world still remained, and it became known as like the new Valhalla, or rather they became known as Valhalla themselves. So they don't really seem to have an idea of their gods, or rather whether or not they're still there or not, even though they still fight in their name. Now, the interesting thing I find about the story is that we've got 10 different factions, essentially, going forward into this new cluster. But does that actually mean that we're going to have a villain of the story? Who's going to be the big bad? Is there even going to be a big bad? Like, who do we support? Is everyone a good guy? Is everyone a bad guy? Are we just going to have mixed moralities here? Is there going to be any story going forward? Or are we just going to have your basic, no kind of like plot going forward? It's just all these characters, all these cool mechanics and whatnot, but we don't really get a sense of a progressing story. We're just going to get tidbits on lore from each of these factions, but there's not going to be like an overarching plot like we've had in all the latest clusters. Now, I for one think that maybe there is one person, or rather one character, who could stand for being the villain of Valhalla, and I could think that that would be Ayu. My reasoning for that is because I don't think Ayu is actually Ayu. I think Ayu is like the form that this person, creature, entity has taken, because of just the way that she gradually seems to decline in her happy nature. It made apparent that because of the way that Ayu works, she seems to take on the persona of whoever is possessing her, or rather her body does. So when we first meet her, she's a were-rabbit, she seems really happy and friendly and whatnot. Eventually, after the demise of the Demon King, she seems to be showing a bit more of her true colours. She's growing horns, she seems a bit more sinister, there's more red in her design, and she seems to be acting a bit more evil. And then by the end, when we get to Winds of on this Moon, she's got full-on like dragon wings and everything, and these weird horns and stuff, and it seems to be that maybe she's like gradually being possessed by more stronger and more sinister souls. And I think there was like a mention in the lore at some point where she's searching for something, I think her true soul, and one of my theories was that the soul that she was searching for was actually Ragnarok, and that's why Ragnarok suddenly appeared, is that Ragnarok was the true soul of Ayu, and she was trying to find it in order to pull all the pieces of Ragnarok back together. But that plot point hasn't really been brought up in the Winds of the Ominous Moon lore articles as of yet. I don't know whether it'll be resolved when the lore is finally caught up and whatnot, because we still have a ways to go to catch up with the rest of it. But I could certainly see Ayu as being the big bad of New Valhalla cluster, mainly because we still don't know too much about her, in all honesty. And the flavor text for Ragnarok back then was that it escaped to the world of Grimm's world, Re-Earth, as if it was being chased by something. I think it would be really interesting if it was Ayu was the one who was chasing Ragnarok, and through all the messing with the timelines and everything like that, she maybe got stuck in that world, but unable to actually access the pieces of Ragnarok that were actually broken apart. And then with the new timeline or whatever, she's managed to get the pieces that she's been searching for, and she'll maybe make her way back to Valhalla, where maybe she has no alignment to any of the armies. She's just this maverick force that seems to exist. Maybe she's actually going to be like Ragnarok as it is, like the end of days, essentially. She wants to bring an end to Valhalla itself, but she needs the necessary pieces of herself in order to become whole again. Maybe the proxies of the new Valhalla chased Ragnarok out because they knew that Ragnarok was a threat, and like maybe it was the one time that they all worked together, and then hey, we're back to war now. So I could potentially see Ayu coming back. They haven't really made mention as to whether or not we would see returning characters in this new cluster. I feel like it's implied that we might see Vising and Kaguya at some point, even if it's just like briefly as resonators or like they're mentioned in some kind of lore, because apparently like hundreds of years have passed since the rabbit guy Atom brought them back to Valhalla. So whether or not they're even still alive is another point, even though like Kaguya is immortal, so she probably wouldn't die. We don't really know if Vising is immortal or not, because she is a sage, and she was kind of like a ghostly ghost sage at one point or whatever, so we're not quite sure whether they're totally immortal and will live that long, or whether they've just faded away into obscurity. But I think it would be interesting. Another thing I was thinking as potentially for villain material would be the only survivor of the original war, which would be Loki. Now, Loki has taken on a very different form than what he had in the previous Valhalla. I'm not quite sure whether to call Loki a he or a she now, because the form that they've taken right now is definitely more leaning towards female. I guess some could also argue it's slightly androgynous, but there is like a slight chest, and they are wearing high heels. So I'm just going to call Loki they, because I'm not quite sure what the angle is that they're taking this Loki, who seems to have a lot of aspects of Cheshire Cat in them, but I digress. I feel like maybe Loki could be another a candidate for being the big bad of this cluster. Obviously, Loki is a survivor of the original war. They have seemed to have escaped from the original war into the proxy world, and now they lead their own faction. Now, whether or not Loki's own faction know that this is the real Loki or not, I find that really fascinating, because Loki's faction is obviously fairy tales, and I think they mentioned sacred beasts as well, or like some sacred beasts or something like that. So I find that really interesting here, that Loki is now taking on the role of like the fairy tale kind of leader, or the fairy tale role. I guess it's probably stemming in with the fact that of all the mythos surrounding Loki as a trickster and whatnot. You could say that a lot of fairy tales deal with tricksters and everything like that, and I'm probably going to delve into a little bit of Persona if I talk about this for too long, the idea of tricksters and whatnot, especially related to Persona 5. But I find it really interesting, and I definitely think that maybe Loki could be potential for being one of the big bads. It would be fairly like obvious to say, oh, one of the darkness rulers is obviously going to be the bad guy or whatever, but if you look at Ayu was a blue resonator, or rather a blue ruler to begin with, and then has been blue throughout all of her cards, and she was like not a darkness resonator or ruler at any point, and she still managed to have a bit of a villainous role, as did Kaguya at some point, where she was still blue, but she does have a little bit of darkness to her. But I always associate Kaguya with more like with blue or wind, rather with darkness. So I think between Loki, Ayu, they are potentially our villains for the cluster, or it might just be the case where we don't actually have an overarching villain. We just see snippets of battles, snippets of little pieces of wartime, like clashes between certain of the factions and everything like that, the different war heads and everything, and the leaders. And we might just not have a villain for this cluster. I mean, it would be different, because every single cluster we've had at least one kind of, right, this is the big bad. This is the one that we need to take down by the end of the cluster. This is our finale moment by the end, where we take down this guy. You know, you had evil Alhama, you had Lapis, you had back in, well, you still had Valentina, she was still a pretty big bad, and then you had like the Cthulhu's in Grim Cluster. It would feel very weird, I think, if we didn't have like just one villain, but I could also see it swinging the other way, where we just have a bunch of different factions who are slightly more malicious than the others, maybe not necessarily outright evil, but obviously fighting in for what they believe in, which obviously might not be aligning to what the other characters are thinking. But what do you guys think? Do you think that New Valhalla should have an overarching story and a like specific villain, or do you think that we should like forego story for this cluster, focus more on just looking at lore, information, as opposed to an overarching story, and that we don't need one specific villain, that we can just have very many questionable characters and their motivations and what they think? I think it would be definitely something interesting to take note, as this is obviously a new step for Force of Will. They're going to be bringing in a lot of new mechanics, like they're bringing in the runes, and hopefully a way that will balance the game from here on out, and we don't get like screwed over by seriously overpowered rulers such as Sherry, who is still hanging around here. No look, it seems that there's no ban for her as of yet, but who knows, by the time this video goes up, might have happened, probably won't have happened. I say that because mostly when I record videos, namely like before the Wednesday, something usually gets revealed on a Wednesday that kind of like tips me over, and I'm just like, oh, I didn't know that they were going to release something on Wednesday, and now it looks like I'm so out of the loop. But I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Let me know down below your thoughts on whether we need a villain for this new cluster, or whether we can just go ahead and just have a bunch of bad guys. We don't really need one specific bad guy. We can just go along and frolic in the fields of wartime in the world of New Valhalla. But until next time, guys, I will see you all later. This video was made possible thanks to patrons such as Alucard, Craig McCutcheon, and the Carnivalous Waltz.